The record was not classified. That was the first thing arbitrator Vensolas noticed when she pulled it from the archive. Not the contents, not the date, not the name of the species listed as the subject. The first thing she noticed was that someone had filed it openly. Every document surrounding the Kale Accords, every annexure, every procedural note from the 7-year negotiation had been sealed under Tier 9 restriction. Weapons treaties always were. But this single file, a field report submitted 14 months after the Accords were ratified, authored by a junior compliance observer named Dara Hicks, stationed on a world called Pharaoh's IV, sat in the public index, unencrypted, as though someone had wanted it found, as though someone had been waiting for the right person to look. Vensolas had been auditing the Council's Weapons Compliance Division for 3 years. She had reviewed hundreds of post-treaty field reports. She had never seen one that began with the sentence she now read twice, very slowly, before setting down her stylus. The humans are no longer armed. This appears to be the problem. She sat with that sentence for a long moment. Outside her office window, the spires of the Conclave District glittered in Marath's twin-sun afternoon. Somewhere 3 floors below her, clerks were processing routine compliance updates, filing decommission certificates, cross-referencing stockpile inventories. The ordinary machinery of galactic order. She looked back at the screen. 14 months after the Council had achieved what its architects called the greatest diplomatic victory in 400 years, the complete, verified disarmament of humanity, a junior field observer had filed a report in the public record with that sentence, and no one had followed up. No one had responded. No one had even attached a review flag. Either the report had been deliberately ignored, or whoever should have reviewed it had stopped being able to. She began to read. Dara Hicks had arrived on Pharaoh's IV in the 42nd month of the compliance monitoring period, replacing an observer who had requested emergency reassignment without explanation. The reassignment request itself was unremarkable on its surface. Health reasons, it said. But Dara Hicks had noted in her opening log that the previous observer, a marathon named Solis, had filed his reassignment request 11 hours after submitting his final field report, and that his final field report contained exactly 4 words of substantive content before it ended mid-sentence. Nobody had followed up on that either. Pharaoh's IV was a human colony world, not the largest, not the most strategically significant, but one of 63 human-inhabited systems that had come under compliance monitoring after the Kale Accords were ratified. The Accords had been, by any measure, a sweeping achievement. The Galactic Council had spent 7 years negotiating them, driven by what the Council's senior membership had publicly described as a species-level threat assessment of unprecedented urgency. The private phrasing, Vensolas knew from sealed records she had accessed in her audit role, was somewhat less diplomatic. The humans had been building weapons at a rate that alarmed every civilized species in the arm, not because the weapons were the most advanced. They weren't. Human technology lagged behind Kethvar manufacturing by at least 60 years, behind Marathon precision engineering by considerably more. What alarmed the Council was the asterisk volume asterisk. The sheer, continuous, almost biological compulsion of the human species to arm itself, to iterate on armament, to treat the development of new ways to cause damage as a form of cultural expression. The Council had reviewed the projections and concluded that if left unchecked, within 2 generations, humanity would not need to be technologically superior. Quantity and adaptation would compensate. The humans would simply outproduce every threat response the galaxy could organize. So the Council had voted. 71 member species in favor, 3 abstentions, 0 opposition, because the one representative who had stood to argue against the measure, a human diplomat named Cassia Ward, had been outvoted before she finished her opening statement. "You are making a category error," she had said, and the transcript Vinsolas had reviewed showed that 11 council members had already activated their voting indicators before Ward completed the sentence. "We don't build weapons because we intend to use them. We build weapons because—" The vote had concluded. Ward had been escorted from the chamber. The accords had passed. 14 months later, Dara Hicks had arrived on Pharaoh's IV, and within her first week, she had submitted an inquiry to the Council's compliance office that had also gone unanswered. The inquiry read, "Please advise on the protocol for a situation in which the monitored population has achieved full weapons compliance, but the security situation has materially deteriorated as a result. Specifically, who is responsible for the monitored population's physical safety during the compliance period?" No response was recorded. Vinsolas leaned back in her chair. 3 mysteries then in the first 30 pages of the report. First, why had the previous observer fled? Second, what had deteriorated on Pharaoh's IV and how quickly? Third, and this one settled into her chest with a particular coldness, why had Cassiel Ward been silenced mid-sentence, and what had she been about to say? She turned the page. Dara Hicks had been trained as a compliance observer, not a conflict analyst. She had noted this about herself with what Vinsolas was beginning to recognize as a characteristically dry precision. Her job was to verify that treaty terms were being honored, to count, to catalog, to certify. She was not equipped to evaluate what she saw in the first 6 weeks on Pharaoh's IV. So she did what any methodical mind does when confronted with data it lacks the framework to interpret. She recorded everything, withheld conclusions, and kept watching. The settlement of Heron's Reach had approximately 12,000 human inhabitants. It was an agricultural colony, grain processing, some mineral extraction, a small medical facility that had been downgraded to a clinic 18 months earlier when the only surgeon had left, and the replacement never arrived. Dara Hicks had noted the clinic's status not because it was relevant to weapons compliance, but because she noticed on her 3rd day that the clinic's exterior wall had a new section of plating, raw metal, unpainted, recently welded, that didn't match the rest of the structure. Someone had repaired significant damage. The repair was recent. The damage, whatever had caused it, was not. She'd asked the colony administrator, a human woman named Rook Parasa, what had happened to the wall. "Equipment failure," Parasa had said. She had not met Dara Hicks's secondary optical sensors when she said it. Dara Hicks had written in her log, "Note, the damage pattern on the repaired section is inconsistent with equipment failure. The penetration angle and metal deformation are consistent with high-velocity projectile impact from an exterior origin point. I am not a conflict analyst. I note this for the record only." She had continued her compliance survey. On day 11, she had completed her initial inventory. Pharaoh's IV was, by every metric, compliant. The weapons depot had been emptied and sealed. The private armories that Marathon satellites had flagged during the pre-accord survey had been cleared. The few personal defense items that had been registered under the Accord civilian exemption clause, tools only, low-yield, individually logged, were present, accounted for, and well below the threshold. Pharaoh's IV had done everything it was asked to do. "Your colony's compliance record is exemplary," Dara Hicks had told Administrator Parasa at the conclusion of the initial survey. "You should be commended." Parasa had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, very quietly, "Is there anything else you need from us, observer?" "Not at this time." "Then I'd recommend you complete your work here quickly." Something in the administrator's voice had registered even through the translation matrix. Dara Hicks had written in her log, "Administrator Parasa appears to be under significant stress. I initially attributed this to the administrative burden of treaty compliance. I am revising that assessment. The stress appears directional. It is pointed outward, not inward. She is not worried about passing inspection. She is worried about something that exists outside the settlement's perimeter." 2 nights later, Dara Hicks had been awakened by a sound she could not immediately classify. She described it in her log as a rhythm of percussive impacts at irregular intervals, originating from the northern agricultural sector, lasting approximately 40 minutes, followed by silence. She had checked the settlement's external sensor logs. They showed nothing. The logs had been manually cleared. She did not report this immediately. She kept watching. By the end of her 4th week, she had identified the following. 3 additional sections of the settlement's structures bore evidence of recent damage repair. The colony's medical clinic, understaffed, under-resourced, showed a patient intake rate for trauma injuries that was statistically anomalous for an agricultural settlement of its size. 14 residents had departed the colony in the previous 8 months, and none of them were registered as having arrived at any other human settlement in the compliance monitoring network. Administrator Parisa held what appeared to be informal community meetings every 3 to 4 days, always at the same location, a grain processing facility near the settlement center, and always after dark. Dara Hicks had attended one. She had stood at the back, translation matrix active, and listened to Rook Parisa address approximately 300 colony residents in a low, controlled voice that carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to remaining calm in order to keep others calm. "We lost the Tennick family's homestead," Parisa had said. "We've pulled back the eastern boundary by 200 meters. We do not pursue. We do not retaliate. We stay inside the perimeter markers and we manage what we can manage." A man near the front had said, "How long are we supposed to?" "As long as it takes." "Rook, they took asterisk children." The room had gone very still. Parisa had not looked away from the speaker. She'd said, "I know what they took. I know it better than you do. And I am telling you that we do not pursue and we do not retaliate and we stay alive. That is the mission, staying alive." Dara Hicks had filed her first formal inquiry to the compliance office the next morning. No response. She had waited 6 days and filed a second inquiry, this time escalating it to the council's regional security liaison. The automated acknowledgement had arrived within an hour. An actual response never did. It was only then, on day 38 of her posting, that she had finally pulled the background records she should have requested before she arrived. Pharaoh's IV's prior security assessments, Preaccord's threat analysis, regional stability projections. She read them over the course of one very long night, and when she finished, she sat very still in the gray pre-dawn light of an alien morning and understood why the previous observer had fled. The HFY, a species with no council seat, no treaty obligations, no membership in any recognized galactic body. They had been assessed as a minor rating concern in the Preaccord's threat analysis, aggressive, opportunistic, but historically deterred by the cost of engaging armed human settlements. The Preaccord's assessment had noted, in a subordinate clause that Vensolas suspected no senior council member had ever read, that the deterrence model for HFY rating activity in human-inhabited fringe systems is understood to be primarily dependent on the perceived cost of engagement rather than the actual cost, as HFY strategic behavior consistently responds to armament visibility rather than demonstrated capability. In other words, the HFY stayed away from humans because humans looked dangerous. The Kale Accords had made humanity look like something else entirely. Vensolas set down the report. She stood, walked to her window, and looked out at the conclave spires for a long time. Then she went back to her desk and pulled the Preaccord's survey data that she had access to as an auditor data that she had never specifically sought before because it had not seemed relevant to financial compliance. She found what she was looking for in approximately 20 minutes because she was now looking for the right thing. The Preaccord survey had used marathon satellite imaging to catalog human weapons holdings on every monitored colony world. The survey had been exhaustive. It had also been, she now understood, catastrophically misread. The Council had looked at the volume of human weaponry and seen a threat. What Dara Hicks's report had forced Ven Solas to see, really see, for the first time, was that the Council had been looking at the wrong variable entirely. The weapons weren't what mattered. The weapons were a signal. They were a message broadcast in metal and ammunition to every predatory species in the fringe regions. Do not calculate that the cost of attacking us will be low. The humans hadn't been arming for war. They had been arming to prevent one. And the Council, in its confidence, had stripped away the message without once asking what silence would say instead. She thought about Cassiel Ward standing in the Council chamber, beginning a sentence. We don't build weapons because we intend to use them. We build weapons because, and being voted down before she could finish it. Ven Solas now knew exactly what the end of that sentence was. She found herself hopping, very urgently, that she was wrong about what came next in the report. She was not wrong. By the time Dara Hicks filed the report that now sat in Ven Solas's hands, she had been on Pharaoh's IV for 14 months. She had stopped filing inquiries to the compliance office after the 7th went unanswered. She had, instead, started embedding her observations into the report itself. A single continuous document that she added to daily, then weekly, that had grown from a standard compliance record into something that had no official category. The Kethvar raids on Pharaoh's IV had escalated in a pattern that Dara Hicks had charted with uncomfortable precision. Month 1 post-accords, 2 incidents, both at the settlement's outer agricultural margin, both minor, both consistent with pre-existing harassment activity that had been previously suppressed by the colony's visible weapons presence. Month 3, 6 incidents. The colony's eastern homesteads abandoned. Month 5, the first casualties. Month 7, the clinic wall that Dara Hicks had noticed on her 3rd day. Month 9, the Tennick children, whose fate she had heard referenced at the community meeting and had subsequently documented with a clinical restraint that she noted in her log was becoming difficult to maintain. Through all of it, Heron's Reach had remained in full compliance. I asked Administrator Parisa this morning how the colony decides who monitors the perimeter at night, Dara Hicks had written on day 61. She told me they take shifts. I asked whether the perimeter monitors were armed with their registered civilian exemption tools. She said yes. I asked whether those tools were sufficient. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "They're what we have." Dara Hicks had noted, asterisk, the registered civilian exemption tools are agricultural implements and low-yield maintenance devices. They are not weapons. The humans are standing watch at night with farming equipment. The next entry was 12 days later, a different tone. I watched a man named Cal Tennant walk to the northern perimeter marker this evening. He was carrying a long metal implement used for breaking compacted soil. He had modified it. I do not know when, or how, or where he found the materials. The modification does not alter the implement's compliance classification because it remains below threshold. But I watched him walk into the dark carrying it, and I understood something that I do not know how to report officially because there is no form for it. The humans are not helpless. This is more frightening than I expected. Ven Solas read that sentence 3 times. Not helpless. And Dara Hicks, a trained compliance observer, meticulous recorder, someone who had spent 60 days watching a human settlement bleed, had found that more frightening than their vulnerability. Why? What had she seen? The report continued, and Ven Solas followed it like someone descending stairs in the dark, testing each step before committing weight. The modification Dara Hicks had observed on Cal Tennant's tool was the first of many. Over the following weeks, she had cataloged carefully with measurements because she was a compliance observer and precision was what she knew a systematic, quiet, distributed project. The humans of Heron's Reach were not rearming. They were not violating the accords. Every item she logged remained technically compliant, but they were converting, adapting, taking the objects the accords had left them, agricultural tools, maintenance equipment, the permitted low-yield devices, and reworking them slowly and with evident skill into something adjacent. Not weapons, never quite weapons. Things that were not weapons in the same way that a clenched fist is not a weapon until it moves. She had brought one of her logged items to Administrator Parisa, a modified soil compactor that had been reweighted and rebalanced in a way that served no agricultural purpose. "This is compliant," Dara Hicks had said. "I want you to know that I've reviewed it. It's compliant." Parisa had looked at her steadily. "Good. I want you to understand that I am telling you this not as a warning, but because I want you to know that I know." A pause, and that I filed no report on it. The two of them had stood in the administrator's office for a moment in which something shifted. Some understanding crossed the translation gap between their species without needing language. "Why?" Parisa had asked. And Dara Hicks had written in her log that night. "I did not have a compliant answer. I told her that my mandate was to ensure the colony did not rearm. It hasn't. I told her that my mandate said nothing about survival strategies, and she looked at me with an expression that my translation matrix flagged as exhausted gratitude, which is not a category in the standard diplomatic lexicon, and I think perhaps that it should be." The raids intensified in month 12. Dara Hicks described them with a precision that Ven Solis suspected was the only way the observer had been able to keep writing: factual, measured, shorn of the language that would have made the facts unbearable. 17 confirmed incursions in a 30-day span, 3 homesteads destroyed, a perimeter monitor killed, a woman named Sira Akafar, 31 years old, 2 children, who had been standing watch alone when the incursion came from an unexpected direction, and who, according to Dara Hicks's reconstruction, had held her position long enough for the colony's alarm system to reach the settlement even though she had known within the first 30 seconds that she was not going to survive the night. "I do not know how to categorize what Sira Akafar did," Dara Hicks had written. "I have reviewed it repeatedly. She was not armed with any weapon capable of repelling the raiding party. She had a modified maintenance implement. She used it. She did not survive, but the settlement was warned in time, and 11 other people who would have been caught in their beds are alive. I cannot make this mathematically clean. It is not mathematically clean." The next line: "The colony held a memorial service. They said her name out loud 73 times. I counted. I do not know why I counted. I think it mattered that they would not let the number be imprecise." Ven Solis's office had grown dim. She had not turned on additional lighting. She read in the narrowing light, aware that she was close to the end of the report, aware that she did not want to reach it, aware that she would. The turning point in Dara Hicks's account came in month 13. The Kethvar had made what their previous behavioral pattern suggested was an attempt at a decisive incursion. Not a raid, but something larger, a coordinated approach from 3 directions simultaneously, clearly intended to overwhelm the perimeter and reach the settlement's center. The pre-Accord's assessment had characterized the Kethvar as opportunistic, and they were. But they were also, the assessment had noted in another subordinate clause, capable of significant tactical organization when they judged a target to be sufficiently weakened. They had judged Harren's reach to be sufficiently weakened. They had been wrong. Dara Hicks had been awake. She had been awake most nights for the past 3 months. She had written in her log, without further explanation, that she had begun standing perimeter watch alongside the human monitors. She had not filed a report on this because there was no protocol that prohibited a compliance observer from standing in the dark with a modified soil compactor, and she had found, to her own evident surprise, that she was not prepared to remain in her shelter, while the people she had been observing for over a year stood outside in the dark with their farming equipment. She described the night of the decisive incursion in 38 pages. Ven Solis read all 38. The humans had known it was coming. They had no intelligence network, no surveillance satellites, No intercepted Kethvar communications. They had known it was coming because Administrator Parasa had looked at the pattern of raids over 13 months and had understood, in the way that people who have been hunted for long enough develop a specific and terrible intuition, that the raids were not random. They were probing, testing perimeter responses, mapping reaction times. The Kethvar had been learning the colony's defenses the same way a predator learns prey behavior, and the learning curve had a logical conclusion. Parasa had spent 3 weeks preparing for the conclusion. She had not told Dara Hicks what she was preparing because she had, apparently, concluded that the compliance observer's deniability was worth more than her participation. The irony of this, a human protecting the alien observer from knowledge of actions that might create a compliance issue, had not been lost on Dara Hicks, who had written about it with a wry brevity that struck Ven Solas as the closest the report came to humor. She was protecting me from the paperwork implications of knowing what they'd built. The humans were managing my treaty compliance exposure on my behalf. I find this both touching and deeply alarming. What they had built was not a weapon. Dara Hicks was meticulous on this point. She logged every component. Every item remained within compliance parameters. The colony had built over 3 weeks a system, not a weapon, a system. The distinction mattered to Dara Hicks clearly because she returned to it 4 times in the account of that night. The Accords prohibited weapons. They said nothing about the organization of compliant tools, the coordination of people, the arrangement of terrain, the timing of responses. The Accords had been written by species who thought in terms of objects. They had not fully accounted for the possibility that a sufficiently creative and sufficiently motivated species might disassemble the concept of a weapon into its component parts and rebuild it from other pieces. The Kethvar incursion had lasted 4 hours. The colony had held. Dara Hicks had been in the northern sector when the second wave came. She described it in the present tense, a shift from her usual past tense precision that Ven Solas suspected was involuntary, a grammatical indicator of trauma or intensity that had slipped past the observer's editorial control. Cal Tennant is to my left. He has not slept in 41 hours. He knows this because he told me 40 minutes ago with a kind of factual calm that I cannot reconcile with what his body must be experiencing. He is standing in the dark with a modified compactor tool and he is not shaking. I am shaking. He looks at me once and he says, "Stay behind the marker." And then the second wave comes. I do not stay behind the marker. Ven Solas found herself holding her breath. The Kethvar had broken and retreated before dawn. Their behavioral projections, rooted in predator-prey optimization, had not accounted for a population that refused to behave like prey. The projection models assumed that a sufficiently weakened target would demonstrate surrender behavior, that the threat calculus would resolve in a direction the Kethvar understood. It had not. The humans of Heron's Reach had sustained losses that any species the Kethvar had previously raided would have characterized as decisive defeat, and they had not stopped. They had not retreated. They had not capitulated. They had held the line with modified farming equipment and coordinated positioning, and the particular human capability, which no pre-Accords assessment had flagged as strategically relevant, of telling each other, in the dark and the pain, that the person next to them was worth continuing for. The morning after, Dara Hicks had stood with Parasa at the northern perimeter marker. Cal Tennant had a broken arm, set and splinted with the clinic's limited supplies. 7 people had been wounded. 2 were dead. Heron's Reach had 104 fewer meters of workable farmland than it had had the day before. "Is it over?" Dara Hicks had asked. Parasa had looked at the horizon for a moment. "It's different now. They'll recalculate. They thought we were finished. We weren't. That changes what we look like." She had paused. "It might hold them for a while. And after that." Parasa's voice, in the translation matrix, had carried a quality that Dara Hicks had logged as something between exhaustion and resolve. The matrix has no single-word equivalent, and I am not sure one should exist. After that, we figure out what comes after that, same as we always do. Dara Hicks had submitted her formal report the next day, the one that now sat in Vensolas's hands, unencrypted in the public index. 14 months of observation, 38 pages on a single night. One question, formally posed at the report's conclusion, in language that had finally abandoned compliance observer neutrality entirely. I was sent to verify that the humans of Pharaoh's IV were no longer armed. They are not. They are fully compliant with every term of the Kale Accords. They have surrendered every registered weapon, every stockpile, every armament the Council deemed threatening. They have done this while a predatory species recalculated the cost of killing them, because the signal that previously communicated that cost, the signal the Council removed in the name of galactic security, was gone. I watched 12,000 people survive 13 months of escalating attack with modified farming tools, sheer organizational creativity, and a willingness to stand in the dark for each other that I am genuinely unable to model or predict or fully understand. My question, which I am formally submitting as a compliance inquiry, and which I am filing in the public record because I no longer trust that it will otherwise be seen, is this. The Kale Accords addressed the question of whether humanity was too dangerous to remain armed. They did not address the question of whether the rest of the galaxy is safe enough to justify disarming them. I would like to know which senior council member is responsible for answering that question. I would like to know before the HFY recalculate. I would also like to know what Cassia Ward was going to say. Vensolas closed the report. The room was dark now. She had not noticed the light leaving. She sat in the dark and she thought about 14 months of files, 7 years of negotiations, 71 votes cast before a sentence could be finished. She thought about a woman named Sira Akafer who had stood in the dark and held a position with a farming tool until the alarm reached the people who needed time to wake up. She thought about Cal Tennant standing in the northern sector with a broken arm on a perimeter he had no tactical training to hold, and she thought about the fact that he had held it. She thought about Dara Hicks writing asterisk, I do not stay behind the marker in the present tense, at 3 in the morning, because something had overridden her observer's discipline, something that had not been in her training because it could not have been trained, only witnessed. She thought about the HFY, somewhere in the fringe dark, recalculating. She thought about 62 other human colony worlds, all in full compliance, all broadcasting the same new signal into space. We are no longer dangerous, we are no longer costly, the calculation has changed. And she thought about all the species in the fringe regions that ran on predator logic, all the ones that had been watching the Council's great diplomatic achievement and updating their models. And she thought about the fact that there was not one Dara Hicks on Pharaoh's IV, but one Dara Hicks for every monitored world, and that the inquiry pipeline had 62 months of unanswered requests in it, and that the Council's compliance office had been celebrating its certification rates. She pulled up a new document. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She began to write, not a compliance audit, not an internal memo, not a bureaucratic summary. A report, formal, on the record, filed in the public index because she had read enough of Dara Hicks's work to understand why that choice had been made. She titled it, Response to Dara Hicks, Pharaoh's IV Field Report, Month 14, Addendum, on the reconvening of the Kale Accords Review Panel. She wrote for a long time. At some point in the writing, she stopped and pulled the original council transcript, the full session, the unedited record, the one that showed the full chamber audio including the moment the vote indicators had lit up. She found the timestamp. She listened to Cassia Ward's voice for the first time, the human diplomat who had stood alone in a chamber of 71 and tried to finish a sentence. We don't build weapons because we intend to use them. We build weapons because there are things in this galaxy that only stop when the cost of continuing becomes too high, and someone has to be willing to set that cost. Someone has to be willing to be the thing that makes the calculation come out wrong. That is what we are. That is what we have always been. And if you take that from us. The vote had concluded. The chamber recording had cut to procedural certification. Vinsola sat with the silence where the end of Ward's sentence should have been. She sat with it for a long time. Then she looked back at her own report, still half-written on the screen, and she added one line beneath the title. Not an official line, not a compliance notation, just something that felt true in the way that things feel true at the end of a very long night, when all the bureaucratic scaffolding has fallen away and what remains is the thing that was always there underneath. They were never the most dangerous species in this galaxy. They were the species that the dangerous things had learned to cost too much to touch. We removed that cost. We did not ask ourselves what would fill the space where it had been. We voted before anyone could make us. Somewhere in the fringe dark, 12,000 people on a colony called Pharaoh's IV were standing watch in shifts. Modified tools, coordinated positioning, the particular human method of survival that did not have a name in the Council's diplomatic lexicon, because the Council's diplomatic lexicon had been built by species who, when the calculation turned against them, stopped, who accepted outcomes, who understood that there was a point at which continued resistance became irrational, and who, when they reached that point, behaved rationally. The humans of Heron's Reach had reached that point 14 months ago. They were still standing in the dark. They would be standing there tomorrow. They would be standing there the night after that, not because the math had changed, not because they had found an advantage the Kethvar couldn't answer, not because victory was near or certain or even clearly possible. Because Sira Akafar had held her position. Because Cal Tennant had said stay behind the marker and then watch to make sure she was safe. Because Rook Parasa had looked at the eastern horizon every morning for a year and said as long as it takes and meant it in a way that didn't have a ceiling. The galaxy had many species stronger than humanity, many species faster, many species more technologically advanced, more diplomatically sophisticated, more biologically optimized for survival. The Council had them all represented in its chamber, casting votes, running projections, building models. What the models did not have a variable for was this: the willingness to keep standing in the dark, at the edge of a perimeter that should have already fallen, with a farming tool and a broken arm, because the person behind you has not finished waking up yet, and you are not the kind of thing that leaves before they do. The Kethvar would recalculate again. Eventually they would try again, and the people of Heron's Reach would be there when they did, still compliant, still disarmed by every legal definition the Accords could bring to bear, still standing, still not what the predators had calculated they would be, still the thing that made the math come out wrong. Not because they were stronger, because they had not yet been given a reason to stop, and they were, above all other things, the species that required a reason.